Next up, last but not least, we have Vivek Sunder, the Chief Operating Officer of Swiggy. Vivek has led Swiggy's business operations since 2018. Prior to that, yes, he's another P&G alumni. He led P&G's business as CEO in East Africa, based out of Nairobi. He's been with P&G for 20 years in various capacities prior to that, across many international markets, and he's here to tell us about his company, which I'm not sure if you heard, was name-checked by the co-founder of the Dada Group just earlier in this conference. Over to you, Vivek.
So I would like to talk about the crisis that we've gone through and the journey that we've gone through over the last 18 months since the pandemic hit pretty much the world, but also us in India, and talk about how crisis is absolutely the best crucible for shaping innovations. This is something which all of us are familiar with. Many people would say never waste a crisis. Crisis is the best opportunity. But what I'm trying to build here is a story around how the company was born through a crisis and how the company has come out of the crisis actually much better, bigger, and much more valuable to consumers than before. So that's the story of Swiggy in India. So I've been in the crucible of a digital native company now for 3 years. And this is something which I believed in before I moved out here. And this is something I believe in completely, that interactions between companies and consumers has never, ever been so intimate in the digital space. It's real time. It's absolutely individualized of n is equal to 1. And it's very, very efficient. And I think that with technology, my belief with the knowledge I have of CPG is that this relationship can fundamentally transform CPG in ways that it hasn't for the last 50 years. So a little bit about myself. John mentioned that I'm a Procter person. I guess if you scratch the surface, I'll still be blue, P&G blue. This is essentially the amazing experiences I had when I was in P&G. This is essentially all the travel that I did for P&G and all the places I lived in. The places which are very dense will tell you the places I've lived in for P&G. So of course, that's density in Europe, density in India, and density in Southeast Asia and Africa. And all the other places are the amazing places that I got to go and meet P&G colleagues before I moved to Bangalore, which is where this story begins. Now, unless you're living in Antarctica, and I don't know if anybody from P&G Signal is sort of tuning in from Antarctica, you would know what food delivery is. Long-time visitors of the Signal conference would know Rappi, because essentially you had Rappi explaining what food delivery is and hyperlocal delivery is. But Swiggy in India is less than 7 years old, and in that period, it's already hit $2.5 billion of business. It's of course part of a larger global trend of online food delivery, which is doing really well, but it's of course skyrocketed during the pandemic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the India story because a lot of the things are common, but many things are different about the India story. So essentially, let's start like with any other good P&G audience with the consumer and the environment. So what's the story in India? One would say it's a series of fortunate events, but I think in our case, it would be quite unfortunate given the cities that we live in. I'm actually streaming this from the so-called Silicon Valley of India, which is Bangalore. It's obviously had a migration of knowledge workers, which has made the population double in a little over a decade, which is just crazy if you look at it. And therefore, this is a teeming city of well over 12 million today. Traffic, as a consequence, is crazy. In 10 years, the average speed of traffic in Bangalore has halved to less than 8 kilometers per hour, which means it's officially faster to walk in Bangalore than it is to take any mode of transportation. And with the dual working couples and everything else comes the dependent on domestic stuff, which can be a lifesaver. But with this level of escalation of population, your dependence on domestic stuff also means that when they sort of fail you or when they're not there, or if you're having unreliable domestic stuff, it's a major, major pain. So the sort of environment was ripe for food delivery. If you think about it, there's a lot of knowledge workers who migrated outside their hometowns. Obviously, traffic is painful, so you don't want to go to a restaurant. And if you depended on domestic staff, when they let you down because they had their own troubles, you were sort of left hungry. So this was sort of the absolute perfect situation. But food delivery in India never really took off until 2015. And the reasons for that are about the friction points that are there in consumers. And it's very easy to find out the friction points if you just speak to consumers. And the friction points were on three buckets. The first one was the choice was extremely limited. Very few restaurants would do self-delivery, and that too within a small 2-3 kilometer radius, which restricts the number of restaurants each consumer had. The second problem was that convenience was poor because many restaurants had minimum order limits. You could not place an order for home delivery if you placed less than a $3 order. And for many people, that was just too much of a limit to order in food. Payment was extremely glitchy, and you had to deal with cash. And the next problem was the timings were limited. You didn't have restaurants open 24/7. Sometimes the restaurant was offering food delivery, but you didn't have staff. So because of that, reliability was poor. So wherever there is a problem of choice, convenience, and reliability, the category can't take off. So the category was extremely small. The category was so small that it was not even an industry as defined by folks like Nielsen, etc. So in this world, we said, let's enter and create unlimited choice. Pretty much, let's open up every restaurant. Let's make sure that payment is just a button press and it's just seamless. And let's make sure we are available 24/7. And let's make sure we are available without having to rely on the store's delivery staff. So we basically took on the responsibility of delivery and took on that friction. And so once we solved that problem, we didn't really throw technology at it. In the beginning, we actually did it with 3 WhatsApps. We had a WhatsApp with the delivery boys or girls, we had WhatsApp with the restaurants, and we had WhatsApp with the consumer and a WhatsApp with Swiggy. So basically, we were just using WhatsApp to connect and make sure that we were solving the problem. And when we solved that problem, we found the consumers loved it. They loved the choice, they loved the convenience, and they loved the reliability that we provided. And so we sort of scaled. We didn't blitz scale, we scaled. We just went into one city. And I'm just going to show you the piece of advertising that showed the removal of one such friction, which is the minimum order. But of course, we had advertising covering every single friction point that I've just talked about. Sorry, could you play the previous video, please?
He's looking for a single. And he sneaks one in there.
Even the smallest food orders delivered. Swiggy, water delivery.
So for those of you who follow cricket, you would know that this was actually playing on the biggest theme that we have in India, which is cricket, and it was actually using a real commentator, Harsha, to play on. And so this said that if you have a craving, and if you have a craving for one little gulab jamun, which is a small sweet, you can actually order it. Before this, there is no way you could have ordered gulab jamun. By the way, after this ad aired, about 5 hours after this ad was aired, the demand for gulab jamun from restaurants went up 11,000%. Of course, this is a different problem that we didn't have as much gulab jamun in the restaurants, but it tells you how much of a need was there that was unfulfilled just because of the friction that was there. Now we scaled. We obviously scaled to the level that we needed to. But what we didn't do was to basically blitz scale it. So we said, let's think about how to blitz scale it. And the way we blitz scaled it was thinking about the consumer and making the consumer a part of the blitz scaling journey. The first thing we did was we downloaded something called an understanding of where consumers were and which cities the consumers were and what restaurants they were wanting to order from. So when we downloaded that data of where all our app had been downloaded and all of that kind of stuff, we found that we were over 1,000 cities where consumers had already downloaded the app and we were not present. So it gave us a very clear stack rank of which cities to go after. We also asked the consumers to tell us which restaurants to add because we didn't know those cities. We definitely didn't know those cities. And last, we asked students in those cities to become the CEOs for Swiggy in their campuses and launch Swiggy there. And a consequence of basically using consumers to tell us where the demand was, consumers to tell us which restaurants to add, and students to also become the CEOs for Swiggy in those cities where we didn't have any operations, we were able to add 550 cities in 18 months. And just for perspective, it took us 4 years to get to 8 cities. And in the next 18 months, we added 550 cities. This was blitzscaling because we actually used technology, we used the ingenuity of our people to scale. So we went from a really small sort of metro city only company to a countrywide operation. And we also then entered into cloud kitchens, which is essentially restaurants that were just a hole in the wall that really didn't exist as far as dine-in was concerned, but they were available on Swiggy and the consumers could order that. So explosion of supply, explosion of demand meant that we basically became India's fastest growing startup pretty much 2-3 years in a running. But then we had the pandemic. Sorry, could you skip the video, please? We had the pandemic. And this pandemic for us, for many of the people in North America, maybe Western Europe, the pandemic was good news because consumers were locked in and therefore they stopped ordering, they stopped going to restaurants. But in our case, it was bad news because in many cities, restaurants were shut because the people didn't have the supply chains. The folks were afraid of actually having consumers or the staff coming in. People were afraid of packaging giving them corona. People were afraid of the food delivery guys giving them corona. People were afraid of the food itself giving them corona. So overnight in 2020, in 1 week, our business fell from X to 20% of X. In fact, on one day, we were down to 0. So we were staring down an absolute hole, which we didn't know where the end was. And so we said, look, what do we do here? We can either basically just give up and say this is a crazy black swan event, or we can focus on what is in our control. And so we focused on 2 things. Number one, we made sure that across the 500 cities, our staff was safe and they were all locked in and they had the right sort of infrastructure to work, and everybody moved to sort of remote working. And then we said, what are our strengths? Our strengths are hyperlocal operations. Our strengths are consumer understanding, and our strengths are technology. So we leveraged those 3 strengths, had a daily voice of the consumer. The entire leadership team was listening to the consumer every day, including weekends, for 150 days during the pandemic. And those insights on what the consumer's pain points were, not about food delivery, about their life, were fed into solving the problems that the consumers had. And we used the fact that we have a hyperlocal fleet, we used the fact that we have technology, and we used the fact that we know consumers, and built it all together to create an operations where we were serving them pretty much anything they needed. So we entered into grocery, we entered into meat, we entered into pet food, we entered into pharmacies, we entered into pretty much anything that consumers want shipped from place A to B in a hyperlocal format, because we understood that and we were basically listening to them every day. Now, we also understood that to resolve the problems of food delivery, we've got to think creatively. So the first thing we did, of course, was to kind of create the whole hygiene factor that, we have a lot of hygiene, we have a lot of sort of safety mechanisms in place. But the consumers weren't really listening to these factors because they were spooked. So we decided to do what good consumer companies do, which is to understand from consumers what's really the barrier that's making them not eat. And the barrier was not so much the fact that they believed or didn't believe the plethora of information they were getting, but the fact that they saw their neighbors not ordering in. So when they saw their neighbors ordering in, they felt that it's safe to order, and because the neighbors are obviously not falling sick. So we actually leveraged that consumer insight and that behavioral insight into a piece of advertising. Could you play the first video, please?
He's got on the wrong foot here.
करोड़ों लोग भी तो मंगवा रहे हैं.
He's calling for a second run.
स्विगी पे 1 करोड़ से ज्यादा लोग ऑर्डर कर चुके हैं लॉकडाउन के बाद. स्विगी, व्हाट अ स्कोर.
Could you play the second video, please?
अच्छा, स्विगी शुरू? सर, करोड़ों लोगों ने कर दिया है शुरू.
स्विगी पे करोड़ों लोग ऑर्डर कर चुके हैं लॉकडाउन के बाद. स्विगी, व्हाट अ स्कोर.
So this ad played on the fundamental consumer sentiment that if it is safe for my neighbor to order, it must be safe for me to order because, of course, I can see him or her every day. And so we had leveraged the behavioral science myth and applied that into this advertising. And lo and behold, 3 months after this entire campaign, our business was back to pre-pandemic levels. In fact, it started exceeding pre-pandemic levels. And not only that, because we had tested so many things out, from a food delivery only player, we became restaurant, grocery, genie, which is basically shipping things from place A to B, meat, health hub, gourmet. We had pretty much a whole new series of businesses that were running. So coming out of the pandemic, which was actually life-threatening for us, we have actually come out and become a bigger company. We've become a more diverse company, and we've become more loved by the consumer. And today, it's a proud moment for us to say that as a company, we've come out of the pandemic with more love for the consumers and a lot more understanding of what we can do with the strengths that we have. So we moved from essentially being the providers of food only to the kings of convenience. If there is anything in a city that you need at arm's length, we're going to provide it to you. We're going to provide it to you at the touch of a button, and we're going to provide it to you real time. And this is something even the big e-commerce players are not able to provide, because we have essentially understood our strengths and applied that to what the consumer wants. So that's essentially the story. I guess I'm out of time, so we'll probably get to the Q&A.
Yes, that's quite a story, Vivek. Thank you for telling it. We have time for just a couple short questions. I was not aware of that expansion in your business due to the pandemic, and it sounded like by focusing on what as you pointed out, what you could control, you ended up expanding your horizons. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
I am curious, given that experience, what lessons you have drawn for, say, consumer packaged goods companies like your former employer. How might that be applied to all companies and to large companies that are in crisis or see an opportunity inside that crisis?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot that actually can be applied to CPG. I think that the first sort of learning here is that the relationship with consumers leveraged by technology can be personal in nature. You can actually have a one-on-one relationship, but aggregate it together into a mass, which is really what mass consumer goods need to do. In the past, you had to segment them and sort of know what the average consumer wanted or the average cohort wanted. Today, you can actually have a personal relationship with the consumer, leveraging technology. The second one is that both engagement with the consumer and the fulfillment of the orders can be real time. In the past, this wasn't real time. So you could actually do both of these things in real time, and that's pretty amazing for a consumer company if you think about it, because the need for a diaper or a need for a cold medicine or a need for a shampoo happens in the house, and at that point of time, today's consumers are not willing to wait for as long as their predecessors did. So you can actually fulfill a diaper need or a feminine protection need or a paracetamol need in real time by engaging with the consumer and fulfilling it real time. So I think the product life cycles, etc., which used to be measured in months and years, actually can be measured in days and weeks if you leverage technology and big data. So that's a pretty huge thing. As an example, John, every night the number of people in this city or every day the number of people in this city who buy diapers is X in Bangalore. Yeah, we are serving 10X that population in this city every night with a half an hour difference between order to fulfillment. Just imagine what that could be to Pampers when a mother has a need for a diaper. 10X that number is already being served by us in half an hour. And that for CPG should be transformational if you actually think about it.
Absolutely. So my last question for you then, you spent so many years in a large corporation, traveled a lot, as I could see from your first slide, and obviously learned a lot that you've applied in your work at Swiggy. But can you comment on the distinction in the mindset between a large company and sort of a first mover like Swiggy? What can they learn from each other?
Sure. The first thing I wanted to actually say is you leave P&G and you realize that P&G has talent, money, and ambition pretty much at the top of the pile when it comes to other companies. So there is absolutely, that's the first thing I'm sure every ex-P&Ger says. There's so much talent inside P&G, so many good people. There is a fantastic ambition as well, and there's a fair bit of money. I think the one thing which I find, which perhaps is the differentiating factor, is that the risk appetite and guarded risk appetite is something which we could do a lot more of. I mean, I feel personally, and this is more a reflection on myself, that I could have taken bigger, better risks even I was there. I mean, it's just maybe something about my own inability to take risks that prevented me from doing much more inside P&G. And I'm sure a lot of what I'm reflecting on myself is true for the present day P&Gers. So I would say that I have almost applied everything that I've learned in P&G in this new environment. And so if I have learned my driving in the old school and I've come to this new racetrack and I have applied my skills, then surely it can be done while you're still inside the old school. So I would generally say it's just a switch that can be turned on. It's not that difficult. I didn't take 1 year to learn how to turn that switch on. It's a switch that's dormant inside each one of us.
Very wise advice, and I'm sure much appreciated. Vivek Sunder, thank you so much for your story and for coming to Signal, and
Thank you.
for being our final speaker of this second annual Asia edition. So again, thank you very much.